All right, so I'm very pleased to introduce Maxwell Mutanda. He is a pluridisciplinary researcher and visual artist whose data visualizations and architectural practice investigate the role of globalization, climate, and technology within the built environment. His achievements include the 2018 Africa's Out Artist in Residence at Denniston Hill, New York, 2020 Rapid Response for Better Digital Future Fellow at Eyebeam, 2020 Graham Foundation grant to individuals, as well as fellowships from the New Museum's IdeasCity, New Orleans, and Akademie Schloss Institute, Stuttgart in 2020. Maxwell studied architecture at the Bartlett, University College London, and is the 2020 MSc in Sustainable Urban Development Sheehan Scholarship Awardee at the University of Oxford. His work has been featured at the Louisiana Museum of Modern Art, Copenhagen, Arc en Rêve, Centre Architecture Bordeaux, the 2014 and 2016 Venice Architecture Biennales, the 2015 Chicago Architecture Biennial, and the Oslo Architecture Triennale 2019. So we're very pleased to welcome Maxwell. He will be presenting some work for the next 20 minutes or so. And then we'll transition into a conversation. We will invite you all to ask questions to Maxwell. You're welcome to use the chat or ask the question using your voice if you wish. So as you listen to Maxwell's presentations, be making notes of thoughts that you'd like to share or questions you'd like to ask him as we transition. So I will hand it over to Maxwell. Thank you very much for joining us. You're on mute, Maxwell.
Of course I am.
There you go.
It is 2020.
Perfect.
Thanks, Elliot. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Jen. I really am grateful for this invitation. It is quite welcome. I don't know if I'm sharing my Chrome. I don't think I am. I'll start that again. Click on Chrome, start share, and I think we're good to go.
That looks good, thank you.
Great. I am just gonna start with, thank you for this invitation. And I really just wanna start by acknowledging the support that I've gotten so far from the Graham Foundation, Eyebeam, and Akademie Schloss Solitude. Without their belief in the work, I don't think I'd be able to do it. I will, hold on, there we go. I want to start by speaking on this idea of political imaginaries, drawing from Edward Said's concept of imagined geographies or imaginative geographies, which refer to the perception of space created through certain imagery, text, and/or discourses. And in this context, the imaginary is not something that's a lie or a fiction. It's something that's more synonymous with perception. So for me, imagined geographies are often constructed on a national level. And this will become a little bit more apparent in the talk, I hope. So for example, here, thinking of the Constitution of the United States, the Freedom Charter in South Africa, or the Constitutional Conference held at Lancaster House in London from September until December 1979, that led to the formation of an independent Zimbabwe, where I'm speaking from today. So these experiences, although they can be quite grand, often experienced at in domestic spaces, such as the single-family housing units that are emblematic of the American dream, or the intimate space of a smartphone and its beguiling promise of progress. So presently, I'm thinking about these imaginaries and the future in a way that maybe perhaps inverts Joseph Svoros' future cone. That is to say, instead of starting from a singular present that has multiple possible or probable outcomes, I see the multiplicity of our present or past lived experience being corralled into possibly a bleak uniformity. And I mean, forgive me if that sounds a bit dire, but I do also think that there is an importance in the narrative structure in trying to develop design that hopefully can influence newer, fairer realities. And specifically, with regards to design and technology, I do want to state that my background in architecture predetermines technology primarily as a medium. So the work that I will share considers digital technology and design and its consequences on the urban, the city form. So I'm going to start by just recapping a project of mine called Dollar Vans that's specifically looked at urban mapping of transit networks. It was designed to be applicable anywhere in the world, particularly the global south, that uses informal minibuses as the major transport networks. In 1931, as you all may be aware, Harry Beck designed the first or the most popular diagrammatic version of the ubiquitous London Underground map, and presently many major metropoles have diagrammatic maps of their rapid transit networks. Harare, like the rest of Africa, is kind of plagued with not a very good formal transit route. In the 90s, we did have a parastatal called Zupco, which was the Zimbabwe United Passenger Company, which at its peak had about 1,200 buses operating around 426 routes. So the project really ended up as a way to consider how these commuter minibuses, which although they are licensed by state and local authorities, find ways to accommodate themselves within the fabric of the city through informal means. And authorities have done little to modify existing transport hubs, for example, to meet what is really an important and ingenious system, which most people in Zimbabwe or elsewhere use to get to work, school, or otherwise. The project started really by considering this reality. On the left is just the Google Maps from Cape Town, and the other is from Harare, and just basically asking how to get to the airport. And one sees just the lack of information available within Harare in particular. These may both be in the global south, but Cape Town, a little bit more urbanized, a little bit more Western centric, has a variety of options. So let me just go back, sorry. So what the studio managed to do was find a third-party app called Transit Wand that allowed us to collect GTFS data, which is a general transit feed specification, using a handful of volunteers. And then we mapped out about 58 unique routes, taking about 300 trips around the city of Harare. The app is open source, third-party Android app that I think is no longer available. But one of the impetuses for the project was thinking about how in Africa, most people do get around this way. And not only that, in this article from the New Yorker around the same time, it became evident that informal transit networks do also exist in America, to the point where the shadow transit networks, as they put it, in New York can be considered the 7th largest public transport system in America. It's very simple. You have a driver, you have a fare collector, and passengers can hop on and off wherever they please. I think a side note here, when one thinks about technology and design, is thinking about Chariot, which was an app-based shuttle service that tried to replicate this model with an Uber-inspired microtransit tech company. It started about 6 years ago, but shut down, I think, last year, 3 years after being acquired by Ford for a reported $65 million. Conversely, the government of Zimbabwe has since revitalized Zipco and made it a touchpad system to travel around Harare. So I am going to just pivot to talk now more about my current research, which involves platform urbanism. Really thinking about how Silicon Valley has kind of revitalized this idea of colonial capitalism. And the colonial geographies that we live in are quite pernicious. So even though some may see the internet or the so-called fourth industrial revolution as something that is egalitarian, social and economic inequalities still exist and are characteristic of capitalism. So the project really considers this new scramble for Africa. So I'm currently preoccupied with the growing necessity to broaden and re-examine architecture and designs past in relation to present-day rapid urbanization and the consequences of our present and our new realities in this sense. Just before I forget, I will just describe the slide, which is 3 instances of the map of Africa, showing the development of undersea data cables, firstly in 2009 in the second quarter, and then again in the second quarter of 2011, and thirdly in the fourth quarter of 2012. So I think it's important to see that in the wake, particularly of the global financial crisis, there was this focus on the production and delivery of landmark digital infrastructure, such as the SAT3 or WASC and SAFE undersea high-speed cables connecting to Africa. And also, this next map shows that the development of undersea cables is very much a part of the capitalist agenda in 2020, 2021, up until 2023. And one thing I want to link here is how this development of infrastructure very much relates to the development of traditional infrastructure like roads and railways through colonization. So if you think of America with westward expansion, how that was very much tied to railways, the same can be said in Africa. So this map overlaid on the map of undersea cables in Africa is a map that shows the railway line from Harare to Mutare, formerly known as Salisbury and Umtali during colonization, where a red line shows telegraph cables and a jagged black line shows the railway route in relation to major mountains and outcrops. So for me, I think it's really important that one considers design as something beginning before anything is even made. And that designers consider the hidden economic value chains and spatial consequences of Silicon Valley urbanism and how they are subsidized by the evolving exploitation of a patchwork tapestry of public, private, and insecurely governed streetscapes and urban spaces. Pictured is a series called Invasive Species by the South African photographer Dylan Marsh, which showcases cellular towers which are disguised as trees. Concealing cellular towers is quite common these days, and the industry name for them is monopalms. Cape Town has the distinction of having one of the world's first since 1992, but monopalms or monopines have existed since 1992 in America. And so with this rise in digital infrastructure, I think one thing that I think is important to consider is how if you lay down a new road, you're more than likely to exact a toll on the users. So the same can be said of the development of digital infrastructures, specifically on the African continent. So pictured here are figures of the average cost of 1 gigabyte of mobile data in 2019. And here we can see that Zimbabwe was the most expensive data connection in the world at about $72.20. And the cheapest was India at about 26 cents for the average gigabyte of data. The US is at about $12 and South Africa is at about $7. So even though there is a trend downwards in the cost in most regions, I think it's important to understand that concurrent to this high cost of mobile internet in Zimbabwe, there is actually a high mobile internet penetration, which is at about 62% via broadband and 90% via mobile internet. So I think it's important to understand that the advent of mobile telephony, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is quite important because digital telecommunications developed where access to landline phones was previously scarce or non-existent. So in this regard, it's not difficult to see the Internet of Things proliferating on the African continent in a way that promotes structural violence of economic and social inequality, which has been prevalent in during colonialism and in post-colonial urban geographies, particularly because of high mobile data tariffs. So within my work, and I think also what I try to do for other designers is try and push this understanding of learning, or specifically unlearning, as something that requires a look at different temporalities, this sort of transhistorical cut through time that gives you a vivisection that will then promote new world building and new ideas of what technology and urbanism can look like. So here's an interesting photograph pictured. Sorry, previously I showed a Maasai herdsman who is also a teacher using his mobile phone to exact a payment in Kenya. And currently the slide shows a group of medical students in Libya who are using their cell phones to light their examination papers because of a power cut. And this is in spite of the heat of North Africa, as well as during the COVID pandemic. So one thing that I think is important to understand when considering digital infrastructure with traditional infrastructure is this idea of how colonialism pervades. The slide shows a series of photographs that follows 4 men walking a suburban street in Harare and using their mobile phone as a way to light their path. And it's quite important, I think, to understand that the development of phones and the infrastructure that it creates these unforeseen developments. Zimbabwe, for example, has an urban electrification rate of 68%, but drops down to 25% in rural areas. However, in 2019 and up until the beginning of 2020, the country experienced power cuts that could last up to 18 hours. And this had a bearing not only on the cost of mobile connection, but also on the ability to provide a stable data connection, to the point where Econet, one of the country's largest providers, went as far as buying Tesla batteries for its base stations, to the point where it became the largest single buyer of Tesla batteries for this use anywhere in the world. So I think what is quite interesting here is seeing the present and how it relates to the past and the future. And one thing that pervades my work is this idea of power geometries, which was introduced by the feminist geographer Doreen Massey. It points the way in which spatiality and mobility are both shaped by and reproduce power differentials in society. So an example might include the control of the distribution of goods and services, or the different circuits enabled by a transportation system. So one of the things that I mentioned earlier was this idea of where does the political lie in this understanding or this look of the future and for designers. And so I'm just going to read out the quote of what land tenure means from the Food and Agriculture Association of the United Nations, which states that land tenure is the relationship, whether legally or customarily defined amongst people as individuals or groups with respect to land. For convenience, land is used here to include other natural resources such as water and trees. Land tenure is an institution, i.e. rules invented by societies to regulate behavior. Rules of tenure define how property rights to land are allocated within society. They define how access is granted to rights to use, control, and transfer land, as well as associated responsibilities and constraints. In simple terms, land tenure system determines who can use what resources, for how long, and under what conditions. So the slide shows an investigation into the history of land tenure in sub-Saharan Africa, using the independence of African states, primarily from 1960 onwards, as the base, and mapping out the different acts that have been enacted since then and before then relating to land. I think it's important to understand how this history and this present has a bearing on the development of digital infrastructures, digital technology, and digital design. And so as the video pans, you'll see I looked at all of the African countries, states, and territories south of the Sahara, just to understand what it means to own land or keep land in this sense. And hopefully this will become clearer to why this is important within the understanding of digital geographies and the research I'm undertaking soon. So I think one of the things that I did mention is this idea of play. And I feel that design as a tool is a way of understanding society and enacting social change through a non-regulated sphere. So I do appreciate this quote from David Graeber, which says, "Play is the ultimate expression of freedom for its own sake." And so here's a look again at a courier who delivers food for any app, take your pick. Postmates, Deliveroo, Uber Eats, you name it, and an understanding of how land tenure has affected the development of these systems and the design of these systems. So this photo is taken from a Kentucky Fried Chicken, a KFC in Cape Town, and it looks across the street onto an island, a walkway, which is used for parking. So interestingly, if one looks at the bylaws for parking or the zoning schemes associated with parking from the city of Cape Town or the provincial government, the motorcycle appears, I think, twice or once. And I think it's key to know that motorcycle parking isn't mandated, it may be offered. And so a lot of organizations have been able to perpetuate a growth by exploiting loopholes or gaps within tenure systems. So a driver is controlled by the land use planning audiences, as well as the Electronics Communications Act, and city acts relating to traffic and parking that allows them to operate as a sort of informal, formal network throughout the city. And so when I think about this, I think one of the things that's important to understand is that our understanding of mobile technology is really based on this idea of automation, but really behind that automation is a history and a model of human labor, which has been subjugated to the level of an algorithm of a machine, and really is how digital platforms have really built themselves up. So here's a view of a lay-by that features a group of digital platform delivery drivers at rest during the day in Cape Town. So in the foreground is motorcycle parking within the city that can accommodate at most 5 motorcycles, but the workers are using just these interstitial spaces in the city that in a way are ungoverned. So I think an interesting way to think about digital space and technology is relating it to Walter Benjamin's idea of the right to the city, and how one is limited in both within a capitalist sense. So as mentioned, like the clearest sign is how little this is considered within zoning and planning laws, and what does this mean in the future? So from this point and from this body of research, I think I'm happy to go into conversation that talks about the upcoming research strategies that I have planned that involve the participatory workshops. Elliot?
Thank you, Maxwell. That was great. And I know from speaking to you previously that this is really just the tip of the iceberg of your work in this area, but it's really fantastic. So first of all, before we jump into questions, I'd like to invite everyone to unmute themselves temporarily and give Maxwell a snap of appreciation.
That's
awesome.
So great, Elliot.
Awesome.
I wish more people would do that. I've been using reactions for a while.
Well, props to my colleagues in design and technology, Richard and Shin, who I think have been some of the pioneers of the snap applause. But I think it's a fantastic way to go. But this was wonderful. I think it's really interesting to see how you merge research and creative practice. First of all, I think from many people's eyes, it would be very difficult to place this within any one specific kind of field of practice. You talk about yourself coming from the world of architecture. It doesn't look like architecture. It doesn't exactly look like design. It doesn't look like art. It looks kind of like some kind of research, but not quite that, because it goes much deeper into the visualization and representation of the ideas. And so I would love to first just ask you about how you talk about the presentation of this work. How does this work enter into spaces, since it is so transdisciplinary, pandisciplinary, pluridisciplinary, etc.?
Yeah, I think the best way to speak to that is if I just think of an example from a previous project that I had the pleasure of working on with a group of amazing architects. So obviously, as I do, I love a whole bunch of data, right? So I've moved on to, apologies, PowerPoint, which is completely different. So this was looking specifically at spatial practices, architecture in Africa, and how qualitative aspects of those spatial practices define them. And so it was really anchored in the sense of community. So how does one build with community in mind? Where does one build? What is the importance of land and connectivity, etc. on that? And one of the things I'm always mindful of is how does one translate this work into something that's easily digestible? And so what we did was just a simple installation that featured a series of videos that the goal was to subvert the view of the division of land in Africa. So we took, I think this example will be, this is Nerea, who is an amazing architect and researcher who specifically focuses on refugee centers for education. And so we created using Unity, a program that created this kaleidoscopic view of that. And it was exhibited in Oslo at the Triennale. And what we did there was simply just create this sort of giant walk-in kaleidoscope that viewers could then experience the research. So I'm very mindful that I like a lot of data points, but it's not the easiest way to translate work to people. So this became how an audience experienced the work. And I'm very mindful of the differences between doing the research and then producing a piece of artwork or a piece of design. But I think it's important to have both in mind when doing the work, if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I'll pause here just for a second to invite folks to put questions in the chat if they'd like, or if you'd like to ask your question using your own voice, please just raise your hand and I'll invite you to speak. While people are adding their questions to the chat or raising hands, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you think about participation and engagement with the various folks who you're working with in these projects. In the piece you just showed us, referencing the delivery workers, certainly there are issues pertaining to the ethics of engaging with a community like that. If one is not a delivery worker, what is their role in conversing with that community? And I know you've been thinking deeply about the ideas of participation. So could you talk a little bit about the way you approach participation and maybe even give an anecdotal example of how you engage folks in the research that you're doing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what really drew me to this specific topic was my previous work that looked at informal traders in Zimbabwe. So I always like to talk about the difference between understanding how one shops in Africa. So this is a roadside market, and one has to understand that because of the economic crisis in Zimbabwe, our informal economy is at least 80% of the country. So you're more than likely to buy your goods and services from the side of the road in this sense than from a supermarket like that. So I showed previously a video with some vendors from a household good market in Harare, and now I'm showing Andrew Gursky's 99-cent store diptych, which shows some supermarket aisles in America. And so as a designer, I first approached this by doing like a whole bunch of fancy drawings. You know, I was really, really happy with myself. But I realized that this wasn't the work that needed to be done. The proposition needed to exist on the ground through the use of people. I think that got cut off. And so what I did do was then engage people on the ground and basically say, I have no right to really be determining your future or the design of your future when you've been doing it already. So how would you design it? But also, how would you consider, and this is particularly where I'm very conscious of, how does this then reach a policy level at local and national governments, right? Because so many people are living within a space where they have so many hidden tariffs. There's, you know, so if you're an informal vendor, nothing is given to you. And this was my main concern with addressing platform delivery workers. And I think it's clearer now within the pandemic, where a lot of people aren't working, non-standard work has become the norm. But your electricity, your access to restrooms, the cost of your internet connection, so many things are outside of your employment and burdens that you take up yourself as an individual. And so I think it's important then again, within the guise of designing within a participatory method, to ask yourself, who are you considering, right? So you can't go and ask the platforms themselves. Sure, they should be in the conversation at some point, but it's really the end user to sort of say what works for you and what would be better for you. I think I really do try and keep two things at the forefront of my mind. This idea of interconnectedness. So like within the work that I'm doing, I know that I will really touch upon an idea of environmental justice, because what does it mean to work on the street for more than 10 hours a day, exposed to traffic fumes at that intimate level? And then also, I do also think about indeterminacy in my work. So although I have an idea of what a solution could be, so it's an idea of understanding cities accommodated taxis, meter taxis when they arrived with parking spaces, right? So it became this idea that if you're a taxi, you shouldn't be burdened to pay for a parking spot. So, there's already a path that I can see, but I don't want that to be the only path that the project has in mind going forward. I want to let other options allow themselves to be presented as the work develops and grows.
As you were sharing that answer with us, I was thinking about the Zora Neale Hurston quote that you brought in to the conversation earlier. To paraphrase, it's something along the lines of the present was an egg laid by the past that contains the future, right?
Yeah.
And you're talking through the example that you just gave, you're talking about this idea that there needs to be space for folks who are part of the systems that are being created around us and for us, and oftentimes by us, but not always, for those folks to also have agency in enacting, first of all, visualizing possible futures, but also enacting possible futures. And so I think in the Hurston quote, there's actually an interesting kind of dialing back of agency, that the egg is somehow created by this omnipotent past, right?
Yeah.
And that maybe the past is divorced from each individual, that there is this kind of plurality of perspectives. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you square the Hurston quote, where there is this kind of universal past, to the work that you do on the ground, where there are all these different pasts, and every one kind of carries with it the intersectionality, the baggage, the bias, the perspective, et cetera, that makes possible all the futures that could potentially exist in the plural.
Yeah, I think the quote is a lot more optimistic than I feel. So I used to always say that I feel like the past is in the future, right? So this idea of everything that we're doing is just taking us back to a point where no one really wants to be, right? That's a big concern of mine. So I think about how, especially say with the development of the digital, like large-scale infrastructure developments like an undersea cable or even fiber optics involves this idea of, like, say, eminent domain is what I think you call it in the US, right? Where the state just takes land, right, for the good of, the people, quote unquote. And so, I see that happening and being replicated. And, where, when I look at mobile data coverage maps, I see them as more like these maps of infection zones, right? It's just like this growing pernicious infection, which at once is a good thing, right? Especially on the continent where people just didn't have phones before in some cases, but also it does take away a lot from people on the ground. For example, in South Africa, it's a lot easier to say put up a mast than it is for someone to own the land underneath their own home sometimes. And so I don't know. I'm a lot more, I don't want to say I'm a lot more pessimistic, but I am. I'm a lot more pessimistic than, than it seems. But I do see the path in seeing the digital and seeing the physical, especially architecture in the city, through the lens of the commons, right? Through the lens of something that can be shared and maintained for a communal good. And how one gets there, I think, is the thing I'm most interested in. And I really do go back a lot to regulation, I think, because architecture is a heavily regulated design profession, right? So, you know, you can't just put a handrail where and when you want it. It has to meet a specific regulation for height and depth, etc. And so I think about the points in which regulation is lacking in supporting people, especially people at the lower end of the economic and social spectrum. Because I mean, it doesn't exist. You know, I mean, until very recently, I thought that and it's so interesting. If you look at the traffic bylaws for the city of Cape Town, the word motorcycle doesn't even exist. So it leaves that space for people just to exploit it, right? You have to go through different zoning laws to find it. And even then, it isn't even a certainty. It's just a, yeah, if you want, give parking. And if you give parking, they describe it as unconventional parking. That is how it's described. And so it's really saying, okay, what can one do to change that perception really going forward? Oh, here's a couple of questions.
So there's a question from Scott Patterson. Scott, do you want to share your question with us?
Hey, sure. Thanks. Great to meet you. I'm in San Francisco, former MFA DT professor from bygone era. And I'm trained as an architect. I was just really curious because, and then I know some of this group might be in the, well, I don't know what it's called now, but the transdisciplinary thing. And just curious, especially about what you just said about these gaps and how you can, so because you have these different disciplines, you can show up in different ways, and how you show up either makes it easy to show up. Like, so if you're an artist, people might not question who's paying you to be there, versus if you're an architect, versus if you're a policymaker, etc. So I'm just curious if you've learned anything about how, you know, if you've tried different ways of showing up and how that's allowed you to kind of work.
So I think I had this conversation with Elliot where I'm at this point now where I am able to have conversations, say, with people in multilateral agencies like the United Nations Development Program. And I never thought I'd ever reach that point. But as I get to that point, I also am aware of how important it is to speak their language. So I'll put it in an academic context. Like, I mean, there's a difference between writing and academic writing, right? If you don't know your Chicago manual of style, you're screwed. So it's this idea to say, how do you then present an idea in a way that is accessible to different people? And so, I mean, as part of my own personal trajectory, I am building up to doctoral studies in development, right? But also trying to, and I think it's quite interesting, especially from UNESCO, who really put an emphasis on the power of cultural and creative practice in creating social change, right? As a way for people to be economically empowered, but also to change people's perceptions of, say, the city or society in general. So I think, yeah, I mean, I will never like let anything go. Because I think, you know, the artist perspective is not considered enough, right? Because it does, I think for me, art has this role of reflecting society, right? And so what do people see when they look at your work, and what do you want them to see, I think is very important and almost difficult to do in any other context. Whereas in policy, it's I'm doing it. I'm trying. I try and separate the work through quantitative and qualitative analysis, but also through artistic expression. So one thing that I haven't shown here because I can't is a visual essay I did for the Architectural Review in London, which speaks specifically to the history of colonization within food production and consumption. And yeah, I think it should be out next month. But I mean, it's all just drawings, right? It's a whole bunch of drawings, a series of drawings that really evoke an idea of the past that people don't really see when they look at that plate. And so I think it's important to use all those tools because I don't know if, I mean, for me, it's great, you know, it doesn't drive me crazy, but I do think it reaches different audiences at different times. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping there's a greater understanding. It could all be in my head, I have to be honest with you. But yeah, I feel that we're reaching a different point. Yeah, I'm not sure if that helps. Well, there's another question before time goes.
Yeah, we've got a question from Vaidehi Supakar, who's in the transdisciplinary design program. Vaidehi, do you want to ask your question to Maxwell?
Yeah, I just want to start off with, like, it was really great to like just listen to your practice and just see in like how you're like navigating through these different disciplines and just sort of like building it together. My question was like, when you're working on projects with communities to sort of like participate, and then like when and then when you actually like make something like and then you showcase it, like, do you take it back to those communities, and like how do they, I'm curious to know like how the communities respond, if they do, like how so. Would love to know about it.
So, okay, there's a really good quote by Adrienne Marie Brown, which I first got exposed to through the organization Black Space, which is this idea of moving at the pace of trust, right? And I think like it's so important. And it was, I think it's interesting for me, say, working between South Africa and Zimbabwe, say, because of the situation economically and socially in Zimbabwe, there was a lower threshold, and also maybe culturally for myself. But you know, asking people to do things differently is always hard, right? And so you have to move at a pace in which they can understand. And so, I mean, this is a good friend and collaborator, Thomas Berlander, always says, like, when we host student workshops in communities, that it's important to let community know the extent of the work that you're doing, especially that student work can't change their reality on the ground, but it is an opportunity for the students to learn from a situation and hopefully do better in the future. And so I think within my earlier work, where I had like no funding, that was something that I had to be very explicit about, to say, listen, this is something that I'm doing, and you know, a lot of it is coming out of my own pocket. So I presented them the map of the transit systems at the Chicago Architecture Biennial, but you know, that funding was all around the event, for example, right? And not on the project. And so one of the things I'm very mindful of is not only to make work that's sustainable ecologically and socially, but also financially, right? So that then going back to the community becomes something that can happen. And I think work doesn't sit within a fixed time. So there's, I mean, I think about this a lot. You know, it has to shift with the future, right? What you do now may not be applicable even in a year. Especially when one considers the digital and how fast that changes. And so one of the things I've done now, which I haven't done in the past, is say to myself, the research is going to last the minimum of 2 years, right? For example, so that there's a continual engagement within the community. And then beyond that, what is the longer term impact of the work at a policy level? So I think, yeah, I think one has just to be honest at the beginning, and also one has to understand the limits of their own agency, right? I think is the most important thing. So yeah, I think, yeah, I said this to Elliot in a pre-conversation, like I try to say to students, like, architecture can't save the world, you know, you can only do as much as you can, you know, and it's not as, I say that not to say don't do anything, but you have to be mindful, you know, curb your enthusiasm, and also be very sincere and honest with the work that you're doing going forward. And people will respect that, I hope, and I found that they do. I hope that helps. Oh,
yeah.
There's one.
Thank you.
Oh, Kansani. So great to see you.
All right, well, we're closing in on the hour. I believe we end at 4 o'clock. So I want to, first of all, just thank Maxwell one more time This has been a really wonderful opportunity. And, you know, just as now a new fan of your work, having learned about your work since we've been introduced, I find the approach you take to this work so humble and at the same time so dedicated. It's really impressive to see how deeply you work with the communities and on the issues that you're bringing up through these projects. So thank you so much for joining. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we look forward to continuing to stay in touch. I know you've got a number of things happening in New York City, and so maybe we'll actually see you in person when the insanity lets up.
Yeah, well, thank you, Elliot. I'll just want to say how much of a fan I am of you, and I can see Chris. You guys are the best. So thanks for your work too.
Thank you. No, it's a privilege. Thanks as well to Shin and Richard for organizing, setting everything up. Beautifully organized, and wonderful to see lots of familiar faces in the community here taking part. I think that's it. Richard, Shin, any last housekeeping notes before we sign off here?
I'm gonna pause the recording.